Back to sharing, back to the graph. Okay, so we know that macroequilibrium occurs where the level of aggregate expenditure, that's this line, intersects the 45-degree line. Okay, so this is our macroequilibrium point. All right, it occurs on this graph at a level of GDP called $6 trillion. So we're in equilibrium, and that's good. Okay, now here's the question though. If we're in equilibrium, does that mean we have full employment? Morgan's shaking her head. Okay, Morgan has the right answer. More extra credit. Okay, let me say that before the 1930s, the dominant school of economic thought was called classical economics. It was one of the neoclassical views. Classical economists assumed that if we were in equilibrium, then that meant we were producing at our potential GDP and that we had full employment. The classical economists also believed that that any recession, any unemployment was only temporary, that the economy would quickly adjust back to full employment and potential GDP. Okay, so what they used to say is unemployment only is a temporary thing. Okay, then what happened in 1930?
The Great Depression.
Yeah, the Great Depression hit. Okay, the Great Depression wasn't just a U.S. phenomenon. It was a worldwide phenomenon, very global, okay? But focusing on the US, we know that GDP fell a huge amount. Unemployment got as high as 28%. And that was a little bit of an underestimate, because if you remember how the BLS calculates the unemployment rate, they call people and they say, have you been employed any time over the last 30 days? And if they say yes, then they're counted as employed, right? But they may have only worked a couple of hours, okay? So one of the things that happened during the Great Depression, I mean, the really bad news is a whole lot of people got laid off, but even people who kept their jobs had their hours cut, and so their income went down. Okay. So how long did the Great Depression last? Anybody know? It's a judgment call, but the way I think about it is I say, okay, as long as unemployment stays below 10%, then we're in a recession, but we're not in a depression. Once unemployment goes above 10%, that's a depression. Okay, just a quick and dirty way to think about it. So if we count when the unemployment rate rose above 10%, went up to 28%, and then came back down once it crossed 10% again, I'm going to call that the end of the Depression. Okay, so it went above 10% in 1930, and it came back below 10% in 1942. 12 years later. That's a long time, you know? So, so what happened when the Great Depression occurred is people complained. They went to their elected officials, and the elected officials went to economists, and they said, what the heck is going on here? And so the economists said, hey, not to worry, this is only a temporary thing. They said that in 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933, 1934, and before very long, economists lost any credibility because they literally couldn't explain the Great Depression. Okay, so then hey Morgan, quit laughing now. It's not that funny. Okay, in 1936. An economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes published a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, I think it is, in which he presented a new theory of the macroeconomy, which did a really good job of explaining what was going on. Okay, and so what happened is the classical economists basically got kicked out and the Keynesian economists came in. Okay, that happened over a number of decades. But here's what Keynes had to say. He said, think about what goes into aggregate expenditures. We know that aggregate expenditure is consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. Okay. Every year, people make decisions about consumption, businesses make decisions about investment, government makes decisions about how much they're going to spend. What do you think the odds are that from one year to the next, all of those things balance out? So if, say, consumers decide to spend a certain amount more, businesses will decide to spend exactly the same amount less. What do you think the odds of that are? Come on, Morgan, what's the answer?
Unlikely.
Unlikely, exactly. And so Keynes' point was, even if we start off at potential GDP and full employment, it's really unlikely that we're going to stay there. Okay, so what he said is, if you look at the data, what you see is that the aggregate expenditure line goes up and down and up and down. In other words, the economy bounces around. We don't always stay at full employment. Okay, does that make sense? All right. All right, so Keynes had two conclusions, okay? The first conclusion I just basically told you. He said we can't count on the private economy to maintain full employment, okay? His second conclusion was, because of the first conclusion, government needs to take a role and step in and fix these problems, because we can't afford to wait 12 years for unemployment to come back down to normal. That's just crazy. Okay. So Keynes actually identified two different scenarios, neither of which was good. Let me see if I can find that. Not there. Let me scoot this down a little bit. That doesn't look like the right spot. Here we go. All right. Do you see the new graph there? Yeah, okay. So I apologize for the graph. I drew this myself, but it is what it is. Okay, this vertical line here shows potential GDP, and by inference, it also shows what GDP has to be to have full employment. Okay, so let's suppose we start at this point right here. And let's suppose that, like during the Great Depression, GDP falls. Or sorry, total spending falls. Okay, what happened in the Great Depression is, first, consumer spending fell, and then investment spending fell on top of that. So aggregate expenditure fell a whole lot, down to here on the graph. That created what Keynes called a recessionary gap. Okay, the problem here is there's not enough spending to maintain full employment. So what we know is going to happen here is, as soon as the AE curve shifts down, all of a sudden businesses are producing up here, customers are buying down here. There's a mismatch between production and purchases. So business inventories are going to rise because businesses are producing too much. That increase in business inventories is a signal to businesses that they need to do a couple of things. One, they need to cut prices. Two, they need to produce less. And if they're producing less, they're going to lay workers off. Okay, so what happens is we move down to our new equilibrium down here. The good news is we're in equilibrium. The bad news is it's a bad one because we're in a recession. Okay, and unemployment is significantly higher than it was before. So that is a recessionary gap. Okay, now the other scenario that he identified is called an inflationary gap. And it works about the same way. Let me see if I have a graph of that. Yes, here we go. Okay. Suppose we start right here. Here's our equilibrium point. And for whatever reason, total spending in the economy jumps up. Okay, maybe consumers are optimistic, maybe businesses are trying to increase their investment spending, you know, maybe government spending just goes up. It doesn't really matter. Any kind of spending can do it. So if that happens, the AE line shifts up to here. Okay. And we want to say the new equilibrium is at this point here, right? Where the new AE line crosses the 45-degree line. But there's a problem there. The problem is we started off at potential real GDP. What that means is we're on our production possibilities curve. We're producing our maximum output. We can't produce anymore because we don't have any unemployed workers or unemployed resources. Okay? So producing more is not possible. What is possible? What's the only thing that businesses can do in this situation? Courtney, she's looking at you. The answer is the only thing that they can do is raise prices, and that's inflation. Okay, so right here, this distance here, Keynes called an inflationary gap. Okay, so we've got a recessionary gap when there's not enough spending in the economy. We've got an inflationary gap when there's too much spending in the economy. Okay, so Keynes said there are two tools that government can use to address these problems. One is called fiscal policy. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. And the other is called monetary policy that we'll talk about next week. Fiscal policy has to do with changing the size of the federal budget. If you think about the budget deficit is government spending minus taxes, right? Government spending is what they spend. Taxes is what comes in as revenues to the government. Government can change the amount of government spending. They can also change tax rates. All right. So in the case, let me go back up here. In the case of a recessionary gap, the problem is there isn't enough spending in the economy. So what government can do is several things. One, they could directly spend more money. Okay. If they did, aggregate expenditure would shift up to here, and we would go back to potential output and full employment. So that's option A. Okay. Option B is they could cut personal income tax rates. If they cut our income tax rate, how does that affect autonomous expenditure or aggregate expenditure? What happens to your take-home pay, Morgan, if the tax rate gets cut? Your take-home, you'll get more money, exactly. And because you get more money, you're going to spend it. Okay, so if the government were to cut personal income taxes, then that would increase consumer spending, which would also be shown as an upward shift in the curve. Or alternatively, they could cut corporate tax rates. If they cut corporate tax rates, that would make investment look more attractive. And so we would see an increase in investment spending, which again would shift aggregate expenditure up. So all three of those things are possible. Oftentimes, when the government does a fiscal policy thing, they use a combination of different things. Part of it is political. We know that Republicans favor tax cuts and Democrats favor spending increases. So to get everybody on board, they might increase spending by a certain amount and cut taxes by another amount. But either way, the AE curve shifts up and we get back to potential GDP and full employment. And in that case, we say the fiscal policy was successful. All right, what about an what about an inflationary gap? Well, the answer is we do exactly the same thing, but in reverse. Okay, if there's too much spending in the economy, we raise taxes or we cut government spending and the AE curve shifts down. And then once again, we're back at potential GDP and we're back at full employment, but with no increase in prices anymore. So that is sort of the graphical analysis of how fiscal policy can be used to fix a recessionary gap or to fix an inflationary gap. Any questions about that? Okay, so what we're going to do over the next week is look at monetary policy. Monetary policy is the other way to address these problems. In order to understand monetary policy, we have to do a deeper dive into financial markets. And what that means is we're going to have to look at the supply of money and also the demand for money. Okay, so if you want to get a head start on this, you can read the module on monetary policy, and I will give another mini lecture on the highlights next week. All right, anybody have questions?
I got a question.
Jeremiah.
Hello, how are you?
Good, what's up?
So I know in the first
test correction, it was exciting to see you in person on campus the other day.
That's me. I'm always in the admissions office. You can just stop right on in here and see me every day. But my question so in the first test corrections that we did, we had to do them with our group. Is that still a thing this time as well, or is that?
You can do them any way you want, but remember the deadline is a week from Friday, so make your appointment soon.
Yes, sir. Sounds great.
I realized that a total of one person from the online class has done test corrections. So hopefully you guys have not forgotten.
I did not forget. I'm coming for you. I'm promising.
Good. Absolutely. Other questions?
How many points do we get back if we do the test corrections?
Half of what you got wrong.
Ooh.
So every question that you got wrong that you correctly explain, I'll give you half a point back.
Okay.
So it's not much. You don't need to bother.
It's perfect.
Kidding. Do it. It's points. That looked like a chip there, Morgan. I got my own just outside of the camera. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I will let you guys go, and I will get to be making my burritos, and I will see you next week.
Bye.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.